In other news we're tracking for you this Friday, Statistics South Africa has denied claims that Census 2022 results are not up to standard. Now, in a report issued by the Centre for Actuarial Research, it's been argued that the census, the 2022 census, might have been overstated. Statistician General Risenga Maluleka joins us here in studio. Thank you very much for coming in. It's important enough for you to join us here in studio, isn't it? The implication is that 2022 census is not fit for official use. What's your response to that, Statistician General?
For starters, is that Census 2022, Michelle, is fit for purpose. And it is indeed being used for planning and will continue to be used for planning by government, by role players, be it other role players, be it business. And it will be used by researchers until we conduct the next census about a decade from now. Mm-hmm. What makes us say that the census is fit for purpose is because one is that a census is the biggest operation a nation can undertake during peace times because it involves everyone, young and old. It doesn't only involve field workers from State SA. So in planning for such a census, there are a battery of tests that you have to do. And amongst them is what we call a pilot test that we put in place to make sure that all systems go. In the pilot processes that we're putting in place, KwaZulu-Natal as a province and the Western Cape, we could not test in those two provinces because we conducted Census 2022, unlike previous censuses, in the middle of COVID-19. Yep. We had a choice as a nation to wait between Census 2011 and Census 2031. But we decided as State SA that we are not going to wait because life was not waiting. The nation needed information for planning. So the two provinces, Western Cape, it was at the height of COVID-19 infections. And in KwaZulu-Natal, we had unrest and we could not go ahead. So we conducted Census 2022 in the middle of COVID-19. The second issue is that Census 2022 was in the middle of unrests that we have seen in KwaZulu-Natal as well as in Gauteng. But furthermore, in the middle of our field work, we had floods because we conducted it in February as opposed to October. We had floods in KwaZulu-Natal, Mpumalanga, and the Northwest. We actually had to halt field work. So that on its own accounts for the undercount that we have seen of 31%. But having said that, it doesn't mean that when you have an undercount of 31%, you can't process going forward as regards the census. So what do we do? Immediately after field work, we conduct what we call the post-enumeration survey. The post-enumeration survey is a sample, about 1%, of all households. So all households were aspired to reach were about 17, 18 million households. But we had 17 million households on as planned. Now, as we were in the field, we could see other households or other settlements emerging. And in the process, we took 1%, that is 174,000 households that we went to visit. So the one thing is that the census team, which goes first, should not know where the post-enumeration survey team will go because you don't want them to focus a lot more on perfections in those areas. The reason for that is that it helps us to see how many people we have missed or how many people we have counted more than once. And in most cases, in almost all censuses, there are people you have missed. If you have 5% or less, you usually don't need to adjust. And we follow the United Nations guidelines as State SA in this, and we have followed such guidelines since 1996. So in the three previous censuses before 2022, as in 1996, 2001, and 2011, we followed the same approach we used in 2022. Coming back with an undercount of 31%, which, by the way, Michelle, was not picked up by anybody else. We as State SA released it as part and parcel of the rubric of data that we release so that the nation knows how many people we have missed. But we don't leave it there. We then adjust for the undercount so that we can have an estimate of what the population is. After that, we take our data, we give it to independent experts, local and international. They look at the data and they tell us that this data is fit for purpose. And they look at field work.
Or they tell you it's not.
Yeah, they can readily tell us.
Right.
But we have never had such an experience, but they could. And we know there are countries that haven't released their census results previously, not even during COVID, because of these kinds of challenges. One such country we know, Nigeria, could not release their census results at some stage. Now, once we are done, we go to what we call the South African Statistics Council. And the South African Statistics Council is a body independent of Stats SA, which takes people from all walks of life, academia, organized labor, business, government, and other institutions. And we say, this is the work we have done. And then they hire their own, or they solicit input from their own experts, local and international. And then they come back and advise the Statistician General. They could come back, Statistics Council could come back and say, SG, your data is bogus. But in this regard, they came back and said, Statistician General, your data is fit for purpose. Now then, the Statistician General goes out and releases the data. Because when we say fit for purpose, data may have its own limitations. So let me go back to the undercount. When you talk about 31% and we adjust for the estimate at national, at provincial, what happens with a higher undercount? As you estimate at lower levels, there are times when you see instability in the data. And it hasn't happened now. Even in previous censuses. In previous censuses, for example, in the previous census of 2011, some municipalities, particularly the municipality of Mohopong in Limpopo, came to us and said, no, we are not happy with our data, but the data was released. And once you release the data as fit for purpose, you cannot go back and adjust it because that process is closed. We continue engaging, but it doesn't mean that when they said it doesn't reflect on what we have, they could not use it for
So SG, let me ask you this. As you were describing the many challenges that you faced in conducting Census 2022, the height of COVID-19, the unrest in KwaZulu-Natal, the flooding, there were so many challenges working against you almost in conducting the census. With hindsight now, do you think you should have postponed the census? Was that ever an option?
Well, there are processes. One is this planning in the fiscal system of government. So, we use what we call the medium-term expenditure framework. So if we were to postpone the census, we would have had to go and restart afresh, asking for money through the medium term. And we would have to be allocated, one by National Treasury as approved, and allocations are done by Parliament. We were doing our budget vote yesterday. We would have to be allocated such funds. So we had to take a decision as Stats SA to say, rather than wait and possibly have the census in 2031, we rather go in now. We didn't know, and nobody knew the world over when COVID would end. So we had a choice to say, do we want to wait for COVID to end? And if COVID took hold of the entire world for another 10 years, when would we conduct the census?
Yeah.
So we had to take such a decision. So in hindsight, it was a decision well taken, and it has delivered. Having said so, let me say also that one thing that we learned when we were in the field, because there's a difference between planning and implementation. When we're implementing with all these many challenges, we realized that we even had to stay longer in the field because people were not ready to open their doors to us. You could not readily trust any strangers coming in wearing masks. But also field workers were also uncomfortable, no amount of training. People were dying. And then on the other hand, once we stayed longer, we actually even stayed longer in the Western Cape to make sure that we cover everything. Once we were done, we were solid and we were able to release the results.
The Statistician General Risenga Maluleka joining us here in studio. Thank you very much, SG, for coming in. Census 2022, that's where you have your answer. It is and always has been fit for purpose. SG, it's been a great pleasure talking to you. Thanks for clarifying